There's something I've carried for years, something so heavy and painful that it almost silenced me forever. For a full decade, I endured the unthinkable at the hands of the one person I trusted the most, my own son. I know those words are difficult to hear, but they are true. And today I am ready to share that truth with the world. My name is Margaret Holloway. I'm 71 years old, and I live in Asheville, North Carolina. Most people around here know me as the woman who runs that cozy little herbal shop down on Maple Street, the one with wildflower wreaths on the door and shelves lined with teas and tinctures made from plants I grow myself. Folks come to me for remedies, advice, and a comforting chat. They see a kind woman who always smiles, who remembers their names, and who asks about their children and pets. What they don't see is the past I've had to rise from, or the pain I've buried beneath years of gentle living. I was once a mother who gave everything to her child. I raised my son, Nathan, alone, worked long hours in a sewing factory and made sure he never went to bed hungry or unloved. When I had a stroke in my early 60s and half of my body stopped cooperating, he stepped in and said he'd take care of me. At first I was grateful. I thought I was lucky to have such a devoted son. But as time passed, his care became more controlling, and eventually it crossed a line no child should ever cross with a parent. I want to be clear. I will not go into unnecessary detail or speak in a way that disrespects the sensitivity of this story. But what happened changed me in every possible way, and it nearly destroyed me. It happened quietly behind closed doors, in the very home where I once felt safe. For years, I said nothing. I was afraid no one would believe me. I convinced myself that speaking up would cause more harm than good. But silence is a prison, and I refuse to live in it any longer. I'm telling this story not because I seek sympathy, but because I know there are other women, especially older women, who are suffering quietly right now. I want them to know they're not alone, and I want to show them that healing is possible even after the deepest kind of betrayal. This is the story of how I survived the unimaginable, and how I took back my life, one small step at a time. I was barely 20 when I brought Nathan into the world. His father left before I could even hold my breath from the labor pains. He said he wasn't ready for a child, and disappeared as easily as he had appeared in my life, leaving me to face motherhood on my own in a small apartment on the edge of Asheville. I found work at a local textile mill, the kind of job that wore you down before noon and left your back aching long after you crawled into bed. Every morning I'd wake at 5, make a small breakfast, and leave Nathan sleeping as I caught the first bus to the factory. I sewed seams for clothing I could never afford, and each stitch felt like another brick in the foundation I was building for him. When I got home, I was exhausted, but I always saved a piece of myself for him. We'd eat together at the little table by the window, and I'd help him with his homework. On weekends, I took him to the park or the library, and when I had a few dollars extra, I'd buy him ice cream or a used book. I did everything I could to make sure he never felt the absence of a father. Nathan was a quiet child, sweet in a way that melted my heart. He used to draw me little cards with stick figures and hearts calling me his superhero. He'd help around the house, without me asking, folding laundry with his tiny hands and humming songs I'd taught him. I thought he was a blessing, proof that love could grow in even the hardest soil. I never dated again. My world revolved around him, and I didn't mind. I told myself that one day he would grow up, find success, and I'd be able to rest, knowing I had done my job. I poured everything I had into raising him. I wanted him to feel safe, confident, and loved everything I had lacked as a child. As he entered his teenage years, things started to shift, though not in a way I fully noticed at the time. He became more withdrawn, spent more time in his room, and stopped talking to me about school or friends. I chalked it up to adolescence and tried not to hover. I figured he needed space, and I didn't want to be the kind of mother who smothered her son. Still, there were moments that unsettled me. He would stare a little too long when I walked into a room or stand too close when I was cooking. Once I caught him looking through my dresser drawers, and when I asked why, he said he was looking for a charger. I let it go, thinking maybe I was overthinking things. There was also a strange sense of possessiveness that grew over time. He didn't like it when I spent too much time on the phone or talked to the neighbors. He would interrupt, change the subject, or pull me away with some excuse. At first, I found it endearing, thinking he was just unusually attached to me. But now, looking back, I see how I mistook warning signs for affection. Despite these changes, he still had those sweet moments that made me feel everything was fine. He'd bring me tea after a long day, or sit beside me quietly while we watched television. He always told me how much he loved me, how grateful he was that I had sacrificed so much. I clung to those words, let them erase the doubts. By the time he turned 18, I had already ignored more than a few unsettling incidents. There was a time he insisted on giving me a back rub after a long shift, and though his hands lingered oddly, I smiled and thanked him. I told myself he was just trying to be helpful. I told myself I was lucky to have a son who cared. It's painful to admit this now, but the truth is, I was blind. I wanted so badly to believe that all my years of love had raised a good man. I didn't see the cracks forming beneath the surface. I didn't see how the devotion I thought I had inspired in him had turned into something warped. When people ask me if there were signs, I say yes. There were. But love makes you see what you want to see. It makes you rewrite moments in your head so they fit the story you're desperate to tell yourself. And my story for so long was this. I raised a good son, and I was proud. I wish that had been true. It was a Monday like any other. I woke up early, made oatmeal, packed my lunch, and walked the same 3 blocks to the textile factory where I'd worked for nearly 30 years. The machines were already humming by the time I clocked in, and I settled into my spot at the long line of sewing tables, ready to spend another day stitching seams in silence. About an hour in while finishing the sleeve of a summer dress, a sharp pain hit the back of my head. It wasn't like a headache. It felt like someone had slammed a heavy object against my skull. My vision went dark at the edges, and the room began to spin so violently I thought the floor had dropped out from under me. I tried to grip the edge of the table to steady myself, but my left hand wouldn't move. I looked down and saw my arm just hanging there limp, like it belonged to someone else. My legs buckled before I could call for help, and the last thing I remember was hearing someone scream my name as I slid off the chair and hit the floor. When I came to, I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines I didn't recognize. The lights were too bright, and my mouth was too dry to speak. A nurse leaned over me and explained that I had suffered a stroke, a significant one. She said I was lucky to be alive, but that my left side had been affected, and it might take months or even years to regain full movement, if ever. In those first few days, I felt like I was floating in someone else's body. My left arm was heavy and numb. My leg dragged when I tried to sit up. I couldn't even feed myself without help. I remember looking at my own hand and feeling like I was seeing it for the first time, disconnected and foreign. Nathan was at my bedside almost constantly. He brought flowers, talked softly to the nurses, and held my right hand when the doctors delivered difficult updates. One evening, after the therapist explained how long recovery might take, Nathan leaned in and said he'd already spoken to his boss. He had quit his job. He was going to take care of me full time. I was stunned, overwhelmed with emotion. My heart broke with gratitude. He said it so gently, like it was the most natural decision in the world. He told me he owed me everything, that this was his way of giving back, and I believed him. I believed that love had brought him to that choice. The doctors praised him, calling him a model son. The nurses said I was lucky, and I agreed. Even with half my body failing me, even with my speech still slurred, I felt a sliver of peace. I thought, despite everything, I'd done something right. My son was stepping up. I wasn't alone. The discharge happened sooner than I expected. The hospital arranged for a home aide to visit 3 times a week to help with bathing and light exercises. But Nathan insisted we didn't need that. He said he could do it all himself. He wanted to be the one to help me regain my strength. At the time, it felt like a blessing. I didn't see the shadow behind the smile. I didn't sense that the doorway I was wheeled through back into our home was the entrance to a different kind of confinement, one I couldn't yet imagine, one where the real healing would never begin. Coming home from the hospital was supposed to be the first step in my recovery. Nathan had prepared the living room with blankets, soft lighting, and a recliner that would serve as my bed for the first few weeks. He moved the coffee table, set up a bell for me to ring if I needed anything, and promised I wouldn't have to lift a finger. At first, everything seemed tender, almost too thoughtful. He helped me eat, brought my medicine on time, and handled all the housework without complaint. He even spoke more softly than usual, as if raising his voice would cause me to collapse all over again. But soon, small things began to feel not quite right. He didn't want the home aide to come in anymore. He said her hands were too rough, that she didn't really care about my comfort, and that only he truly understood what I needed. I protested once lightly, but he insisted and made the call to cancel her visits. He became particular about my schedule, when I could eat, when I could nap, even when I could have visitors. Friends from church would stop by and he would turn them away saying I was too tired or had just taken medicine. The phone barely rang, and when it did, he answered and said I was resting. He took over all communication with the outside world. I didn't think much of it at first. I was groggy from the stroke, still relearning how to speak without slurring. But I missed the comfort of voices that weren't his. I missed the silence that wasn't laced with expectation. His touch started to change too. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a hand that lingered too long when helping me sit up. Fingers brushing across my chest while adjusting my blanket. A gaze that lasted a second longer than it should when I shifted in bed. When I tried to bring it up, he brushed it off. He'd smile and say I was imagining things that medications could mess with perception. He said he was just doing what a son should do and I should be grateful I didn't end up in a nursing home. He began handling my bathing alone. He said it was safer that strangers wouldn't be as gentle with someone in my condition. I agreed, because I was too tired to argue, and a part of me still trusted the boy I raised. But the baths began taking longer, his instructions more detailed. He'd speak calmly, explaining how people who were paralyzed needed extra attention to avoid infection. He used medical terms I didn't understand. He'd say he read about it online, that it was all for my benefit, that he was protecting me. The first time something happened that I couldn't explain away, I froze. He had just helped me out of the bath, his towel wrapped around me, when he started patting me dry. But instead of stopping at my back and shoulders, his hands slid across my chest and lower. I flinched, weakly tried to move, but he just smiled and told me not to be embarrassed. He said he had to make sure everything was clean. He said he'd do whatever it took to keep me safe. I felt my skin crawl, but I said nothing. I stared at the ceiling and counted backwards from 10, like they taught us in childbirth classes decades ago. That night, I didn't sleep. My heart raced with confusion and dread. I wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding, that I was overreacting, but deep down, something in me shifted. The house that once felt like home now felt like a trap, and the son I loved no longer felt like mine. Time lost meaning after that first bath. Days bled into nights, and I began to measure time by how many times Nathan walked through the door with towels draped over his arm. He kept a schedule that seemed helpful on the surface: breakfast at 8, medicine at 9, exercises by 10, but it wasn't routine. It was control dressed up as caregiving. He took away my access to everything. The phone was moved to another room. My church friends were told I wasn't well enough for visitors. The blinds stayed drawn, and the only voices I heard were his and the low hum of the TV, always on channels he picked. When I asked to speak to someone, he'd tell me not to worry them. He said I wasn't thinking clearly, that stress could cause setbacks after a stroke. He'd smile and stroke my hair, as if calming a child, then remind me how easily people confuse confusion with illness. He started using medical terms more often, speaking with a tone of authority that left little room for doubt. He said paralysis could cause all sorts of symptoms: memory loss, emotional instability, even imagined sensations. When I flinched during his so-called physical therapy, he said it was my nerves misfiring. The worst part was that I started believing him. When you live in isolation long enough, you begin to question everything. I doubted my instincts, my memories, even my sense of what was real. He made me feel like my own thoughts couldn't be trusted. He'd talk to me about infection risks and circulation problems, and say how lucky I was to have someone who understood all the right techniques. When his hands moved places they shouldn't, he'd say it was part of a lymphatic massage. When I cried, he said crying was a normal symptom in stroke recovery. At times I tried to resist. I'd turn my face away or whisper that something didn't feel right. He'd respond with a calm, unwavering voice telling me I was ungrateful. That without him, I'd be wasting away in a state-run nursing home, being changed by strangers who didn't care if I lived or died. He began to say things like only he knew what I needed, that we had a special bond, that real love meant doing things others wouldn't understand. I wanted to scream, but I didn't have the strength. My body had betrayed me, and so had my son. Whenever someone knocked on the door, he answered quickly and sent them away. If a neighbor asked how I was, I'd say I was resting, and that visitors would disturb my recovery. He even lied to the doctor during follow-up appointments, saying I was too tired to attend or too confused to speak clearly. I would sit by the window sometimes when he allowed it and watch people walk by. Each passerby seemed like a world away. I could hear birds outside and smell the rain on the driveway, but the house itself felt like a cage, and I was its quietest prisoner. Every attempt I made to speak up was met with calm dismissal. He was always composed, never angry, just firm, just confident. That made it worse. His cold, calculated calm made me doubt whether anyone would believe me if I told them. Who would take the word of a half-paralyzed woman over a son who gave up everything to take care of her? Even the medications felt suspect. He started giving me supplements he claimed were prescribed to help with energy and sleep, but they made me foggy, too tired to fight, too slow to react. I began to forget what day it was, what time it was, even what I'd tried to say just moments before. And every time I asked if something was wrong, if his methods were too much, he'd say he was protecting me. He'd say this is what love looks like when it has to be strong. He'd say I should thank him because no one else would ever do what he was doing for me. That sentence echoed in my head more than any other. No one else would do this for you. In time, I stopped speaking those thoughts aloud. I let silence settle like dust on the curtains. And in that silence, something in me began to break. Not a loud break, but a slow, aching fracture. A realization that I no longer lived in a home. I lived in his story, and I had no say in how it was told. It was the middle of July, and the air in the house felt thick, like something alive pressing against my skin. Nathan had just finished another one of his so-called treatments, and I was left lying on the recliner covered with a blanket that suddenly felt too heavy to bear. Something in me snapped that day. I could feel it like a match sparking in a long, dry forest. I don't know where the strength came from. Maybe it was the heat, the quiet hum of the neighbor's lawnmower, or the way the sunlight hit the window just right. But as soon as I heard Nathan step out to take the trash, I pushed myself up with everything I had. My left side trembled useless, but I used my good arm to pull myself toward the front door. The carpet burned my skin as I dragged across it. My breaths came fast and sharp, and my vision blurred. I reached the doorknob with shaking fingers and yanked it open, falling halfway onto the porch with a dull thud. I screamed. Not words, just sound. Raw, cracked, desperate sound. Across the street, my neighbor Carol dropped her watering can. I saw her mouth open as she rushed toward me, her hands already outstretched. She called my name over and over, and I could only nod my throat too tight to speak. She wrapped a towel around me and dialed 911 without hesitation. Everything after that moved too fast and too slow at once. The ambulance lights stung my eyes. The paramedics asked questions, but I could barely answer. Carol rode with me, holding my hand the whole time, whispering that I was safe, now that it was going to be okay. At the hospital, the nurses were brisk and professional. They undressed me, gently checked for bruises, took blood, and asked questions I couldn't form answers to. One of them, a woman maybe in her 50s, leaned in close and said she'd seen this before. Her eyes didn't blink when I looked back at her. She believed me before I even spoke. The doctor was quiet at first, but his questions were sharp and precise. He asked if I felt safe at home. I shook my head. He asked if I had ever been hurt. I nodded. Then he asked if the person responsible was someone close to me. That's when the tears finally came. I don't remember everything I said. It came out in fragments: bath time, medication, cancelled visits, things I couldn't describe without shaking. But the look on his face told me he understood more than I could say. He turned to the nurse and said the words I'd longed to hear for years. "We're reporting this." They moved me to a private room. Carol stayed by my side, refusing to leave. A police officer came to speak with me, and though I was terrified, I told him the truth. I told him what had been done. I told him how long it had gone on. And when he wrote it all down, I felt something uncoil in my chest. For the first time, someone was writing my story the way it really happened. Nathan never came back to the hospital. The officers found him at the house trying to erase files from a laptop and burn old journals. He was arrested on the spot. They told me he didn't even ask why. He just said he was trying to protect his mother. That night, in the quiet of the hospital room, I lay awake for hours. I listened to the soft beeping of machines, the shuffle of nurses' shoes in the hallway, and I cried not from fear, but from relief. For the first time in nearly a decade, I was in a place where no one could reach me without permission. The chains were breaking, slowly, one by one, and with each breath, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could reclaim the pieces of myself I thought were gone forever. The weeks after Nathan's arrest felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. I was placed in protective care first, then transferred to a long-term recovery facility where both my body and mind could begin to heal. Everything felt new, even the smallest movements, and I clung to each little victory as proof that I was still here. My cousin Evelyn offered me a place in her home just outside Asheville, a cozy bungalow with soft green shutters and a porch that always smelled like rosemary. She greeted me not with pity, but with patience, and that was exactly what I needed. Living with her felt like being wrapped in a quilt, warm, steady, and safe. Physical therapy was slow and painful. My left arm remained weak, but the therapists encouraged me with every tiny step forward. I learned to stand again, to shuffle between railings, and eventually to walk with a cane. Every session left me exhausted, but I welcomed the ache. It meant I was rebuilding something he had tried to break. Therapy for my mind was harder. Speaking about what happened made me tremble at first. There were days when the shame clung to me like damp clothes, but over time, with a gentle counselor who never rushed me, I started to understand that the guilt was never mine to carry. Evelyn introduced me to herbs. She had a garden full of them, thriving and fragrant, and she believed in their power to soothe the body and soul. I began helping her dry lavender steep peppermint for headaches and blend calming teas. Working with my hands again gave me purpose, and slowly that purpose turned into passion. Together we turned a corner of her kitchen into a small apothecary. Then a neighbour asked for a sleep remedy. Then another wanted something for joint pain. Before long, word spread, and we opened a tiny herbal shop just down the road. It became a place of healing, not just for others, but for me. Women started to come not only for herbs, but for conversation. Some whispered about husbands who shouted too much. Others came with silence so heavy I recognized it before they spoke. I never pushed them to share, but I listened. And that listening became its own kind of medicine. I gave talks at local libraries about recovery after trauma. I visited shelters and offered free calming tea blends to women who couldn't sleep. I told pieces of my story, not all of it, not at first, but just enough for others to see that I understood, that I had been in that dark place too, and that it was possible to leave it behind. Each day wasn't perfect. There were setbacks, flashbacks. Nights when I woke, drenched in fear. But the difference was, I wasn't alone anymore. I had Evelyn. I had a community. And I had myself finally returned to me after so many years lost. Healing wasn't a straight path. It twisted and turned and dropped me without warning, but it also lifted me in ways I never expected. And every time I brewed tea for a woman who couldn't find the words for her pain, I remembered the silence I once lived in. Then I handed her a warm cup and showed her that even silence can be broken. It had been nearly 20 years since I last saw him. The bell above the shop door jingled, and when I looked up, I barely recognized the man standing there. He was thin, pale, moving slowly with a cane, his hands trembling slightly as he leaned against the doorframe. It was Nathan. Older, worn his body betraying him just as mine once did. He looked at me with watery eyes and tried to smile, but I felt nothing. Not fear, not warmth, just a cold, still silence inside my chest. He said he had multiple sclerosis now, said he was sorry, said he'd spent years thinking about what he did and how he hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive him. I let him speak until the words dried up. Then I stepped out from behind the counter and stood tall cane in one hand spined straight. I told him I remembered every time he locked the door and shut the blinds. Every time he whispered twisted words into my ear while calling it care. Every time I cried, and he said it was just my imagination. I didn't shout. I didn't shake. I was steady. I told him that my healing had never required his apology, that the life I rebuilt didn't need his presence or his approval. That which he called love was nothing but control wrapped in the mask of duty. He said he had nowhere to go, that he needed someone, that I was still his mother. I looked him straight in the eye and said the words I had carried in my chest for 2 decades. My son died a long time ago. The bell jingled again as I held the door open and watched him leave. He didn't look back, and I didn't need him to. I turned off the open sign and stood alone in the quiet, my breath steady, my heart unshaken. Some might say forgiveness is strength, but for me, knowing I didn't owe him anything that was the strongest I had ever felt. Today I live in a little house with blue shutters and a front porch filled with potted herbs. I run my shop with pride, surrounded by women who have become my sisters in strength and healing. And yes, I have a man in my life now. He's kind, patient, and most importantly, he listens. I am no longer defined by what was done to me. I am defined by how I rose. Every woman deserves that chance, no matter her age, no matter how deep the pain. If you're over 50, if you've survived something no one should know this, you still matter. You are still worthy of joy, of love, of peace. Don't stay silent. Tell your truth. Even if your voice shakes, speak anyway, because someone is listening, and your story could be the one that saves another life. If my journey spoke to you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or just say you're here. Like this video if you believe in second chances, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories of survival and strength. You are not alone, and your life is far from over.